All right, so this is the rest of chapter 10. So I'm going to skip to where we left off in class. So we went through all this stuff, yes. All right, so we left off with talking about responses to learning disabilities. So this is a particular approach that you will see if you are in a school system. It's called response to intervention. So the basic idea with response to intervention is that there are 3 tiers or 3 levels of intervention, and that's what you see demonstrated here. So at the first level, we provide basic instruction. Okay, so think about the regular education that you would get as part of the normal school day. So most students, as you can see here, about 80% will respond to that regular education instruction with no problem. There will, however, be some students who need an additional level of support here. And so that's what we're looking at here with this tier number 2. So this might look like maybe providing some students with advanced tutoring or something like that to give them some additional support. And for most of those students, then that will be just fine, right? And that will get them to the level where they need to be. There will then also be some students on top of that who need even more. So they haven't responded to the first level of intervention. They haven't responded to the second level of intervention. Now they need to have a more intensive and typically a very individualized kind of approach here. So this might look like maybe a one-on-one professional who works directly with a child. So reading is a really good example of this. So in an average elementary school classroom, we have most children who will be just fine with the normal reading instruction in class. Some kids might need a little bit more, so we might have maybe a small group of children who work with the classroom teacher while the rest of the class is doing some kind of other assignment, so they get additional help and support. And then we might have some children who need even more help and support, and so that would be our third level here. So that would be maybe children who go and meet with a reading specialist one-on-one. So response to intervention, you will definitely see this if you are in the elementary school system. It works very well, has a lot of research support, but this is kind of the dominant approach that we have available now for addressing learning disabilities for students. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk next about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also called ADHD. Okay, so this is classified as what we call a neurodevelopmental disorder, meaning that we know it is a function of neuro, so that's your neurons, your nervous system, the brain in particular, and developmental, how the brain develops. So there seems to be some brain differences in children who are born essentially with this and how the brain organizes itself over the first few years of life in children's brains who are diagnosed with ADHD compared to children who are not. So things to note here. So for ADHD, there are kind of 2 primary types of symptoms. So we have symptoms of inattention. So the child has a very large degree of difficulty focusing on something for a long period of time. Their attention wanders. They have a hard time filtering out irrelevant information. So that would be the inattention piece. The other facet of ADHD is the hyperactive and impulsive behaviors. So hyperactivity, meaning an extremely high level of energy. So kids who it almost seems like they're powered by like a motor or something like that. They never stop. They are in constant motion, kind of constantly moving, constantly fidgeting. They're moving all the time. They can't sit still. So that would be an example of hyperactive. And then impulsive, doing things without thinking, right? So inability to exercise that degree of self-regulation, self-control. And so that can lead to, of course, problems, right? So when we're looking at ADHD, we do see some gender differences here. So we tend to see that girls are more likely to be diagnosed as having predominantly the inattentive type of ADHD. So predominantly showing those symptoms of inattention, whereas boys are more likely to be diagnosed with the hyperactive and impulsive subtype of ADHD. There's also what we call a combined type of ADHD, which includes both symptoms of inattention and hyperactivity, and boys are more likely to be diagnosed with that. We don't typically see the diagnosis of ADHD until a child starts school, and that makes sense, right? So it typically, before school starts, they don't really have demands on their attention or their kind of hyperactive and impulsive behaviors. But once school starts, there's considerable work that needs to be done that requires focused and sustained attention, also requires you to be able to sit still, right? And so oftentimes we don't see the diagnoses for these until school. We also tend to see differences in the percentage of children diagnosed. So boys much more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD on the whole, likely because they're more likely to have the hyperactive impulsive subtype or the combined subtype. And that is typically disruptive in the classroom. So teachers don't like it. These kids who have ADHD are oftentimes behavior problems. So they really challenge teachers in terms of classroom management. So teachers are likely to see it as a problem. For girls, if you're inattentive, well, you might just be kind of daydreaming, right? Like staring out the window all day, but you're likely not a behavior problem. And so oftentimes it goes unnoticed in girls. So that's part of the reason that we see that gender divide. All right, so interventions, and you can see over here, this research reporting the results from trials comparing different interventions for ADHD. So there are several options here. So one of the most common intervention in terms of treatment is the use of medication, and in particular, the use of stimulant medication. So like Ritalin, for example, Cymbalta, that's another one. So those particular medications, it sounds counterintuitive. Like, why would we use a stimulant medication? But essentially, the way that they work, they stimulate production of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is connected to attention, to focus, to learned behaviors. And so by stimulating that production of dopamine in the brain, it essentially allows the child to be able to focus, right? To pay attention to what needs to be done and also to control those behaviors. There's also, though, therapy. So therapy for the child and also for the parents, because as you can imagine, this is very difficult to deal with. So for children, oftentimes the therapy focuses on behavior therapy. So how do you do things like stick to a schedule, for example? And for parents, it oftentimes focuses on how to manage the child's behavior and also how to deal with the levels of stress that result from this. So as you can see from the research over here, when we look at a combination of medication plus therapy, that appears to have the best outcomes compared to using medication alone or using therapy alone. So the combination of the two appears to have the best outcomes for the child.